Justice League when the guy Flash asked Batman, "What's your superpower?" And he says, "I'm rich." You know, I just love that. But so they have all these superpowers, but what we connect with our hearts is usually their weaknesses of where they come from and where it originates and what made them them. So as we kick off the Philippians study, today what we're going to do is actually look at the origin story and the backstory of why is Philippians so special and why is it so special 2,000 years later for us still reading it today. Because as Paul writes this, the Apostle Paul writes Philippians, he has a special place in his heart for this church. He loves the Philippian church. In fact, of all the churches that he writes to, this is the only one that he hardly says a word of rebuke or instruction. He just throws out encouragement and praises, and he loves this church. In fact, of all the churches he planted, apparently this is the one that understood the gospel and Jesus movement the best at that moment in history, because they're the ones who seem to be the healthiest church in the way that they fulfilled being a faith community together. This is why I want to read it, because as we're coming back together as a church, I want us to be a healthy church. I want us to know, how do we do this? Been kept by the Holy Spirit from preaching the word in the province of Asia. So he's got these boundaries and he's trying to be sensitive to where God's leading him next. And he's like, for some reason, I'm prevented from going to certain regions. And so he's trying to be led by the Spirit, trying to discern where should I go next. And it says his companions, and he has three main companions on his second missionary journey. His first one, it was Paul and Barnabas and John Mark. But his third one was Luke, Timothy, and Silas. Timothy, who he's writing this Philippians letter with, is actually his young protege, his intern, or his resident assistant, if you would. And Timothy's trying to learn how to be a pastor and a missionary church planter. And so Paul's teaching him how to do this. So Timothy's a young guy. And we have two letters that Paul wrote to Timothy coaching him on how to become this. Now, also, Silas is also known as Silvanus in other passages. And if your name was Silvanus, you'd say, just call me Silas. Just call me Silas. And a lot of the story that we're going to read about, it's Paul and Silas. They're the two key figures in this story and who they meet. So verse 7 and 8. When they came to the border of Mysia, they tried to enter another weird town, but the Spirit of Jesus would not allow them to go. So they passed by Mysia and went to the town of Troas. Verse 9. During the night, Paul had a vision of a man of Macedonia standing and begging him, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." And after Paul had seen the vision, we got ready at once to leave for Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. And so he has this vision, this dream, and apparently they talked about it and we're trying to figure out, what do you think God's trying to tell us? And they come to the conclusion, we got to go to Macedonia. If God's given you a vision to go reach someone over there, we've got to head over there. And the largest city in Macedonia in that time was Philippi. And so verse 12, we traveled to Philippi, a Roman colony and the leading city of that district of Macedonia, and we stayed there for several days. A major commercial city. It's a good place for Paul to plant a church. Verse 13, on the Sabbath, we went outside the city gate to the river where we expected to find a place of prayer. We sat down and began to speak to the women who had gathered there. Now here's what's common when Paul goes to start a church. He would normally go to a city and see if there's a synagogue somewhere in the city. Because Jesus was Jewish and he was the Messiah who fulfilled everything in the Old Testament. And so he would start with, let me go to the Jewish believers first, because maybe they haven't heard yet that the Messiah has showed up. So let me start with people who have a little bit of context about who this Messiah is first. And as he's looking for a synagogue, it tells us something about Philippi, that they don't have any Christians in the entire city. And they hardly have any Jewish men and leaders in the entire city because they don't even have a synagogue.